My dear friends, I want you to settle in with me today because I'm about to share a story that will shake you to your very core. It's about a woman named Margaret Holloway, 75 years old, living quietly in the leafy suburbs of Boston. Now, you might think you know where this elderly wisdom story is headed, but I promise you, what unfolds will challenge everything you believe about family loyalty and the price of unconditional love. Margaret wasn't just any ordinary widow. She was the kind of woman who had dedicated her entire life to teaching high school students, watching them grow, and helping shape young minds for over 40 years. Her small colonial house on Maple Street still bore the gentle touches she and her late husband Robert had added over 3 decades of marriage. The rose bushes he planted for their anniversary, the kitchen window she'd insisted on enlarging to catch the morning sun, and the family photos that told the story of a life well lived. But here's what made Margaret truly remarkable, and perhaps what would later become her greatest vulnerability. After Robert passed away 5 years earlier, leaving her with her carefully saved retirement nest egg of nearly $500,000, she had one driving force in her life: her son Daniel, her only child, her pride and joy, the boy she'd raised to be responsible, kind, and grateful. At least, that's what she believed. You see, Margaret had always been what we call a giver. When Daniel married Claire 15 years ago, Margaret was the first to welcome her new daughter-in-law with open arms. When they needed help with the down payment for their dream house in Newton, a beautiful colonial worth $800,000, Margaret didn't hesitate to write that check for $150,000. "It's an investment in your future," she told them, watching Daniel's face light up with relief and gratitude. And the gifts didn't stop there. Oh no. When Claire mentioned needing a more professional vehicle for her real estate career, Margaret surprised him with the keys to a brand new $60,000 Lexus SUV. "You can't show luxury homes in an old Honda," she laughed, remembering how her own mother had always said appearances mattered in business. Then came the grandchildren, Nathan, now 19, and little Emma, just 16. Margaret's heart practically burst with love for those two. When Nathan got accepted to Harvard, yes, Harvard, and the family was stressed about the $40,000 annual tuition, guess who stepped in? That's right. Margaret liquidated part of her retirement fund without a second thought. "Education is the one gift that can never be taken away," she declared, echoing the very words her own immigrant parents had told her decades earlier. The hurricane damage to their roof last spring? Another $25,000 from Margaret's savings. The family vacation to Disney World when Nathan graduated high school? Margaret insisted on covering the entire $8,000 trip. "Memories are priceless," she'd said, watching her family pose for photos in front of Cinderella Castle, their faces glowing with happiness that she had made possible. But here's where our story really begins, my friends. On this particular Tuesday evening in October, Margaret was getting ready for what Daniel had described as a special family dinner. He'd called her 3 days earlier, his voice unusually animated. "Mom, we're having some friends over this Saturday, but before that happens, Claire and I want to have a private family dinner. Just us, the kids, and you. We have something really important to share." Margaret had spent the entire week wondering what this announcement could be. Maybe Claire was pregnant again. Perhaps Nathan had received some special recognition at college. Or maybe, and this thought made her heart flutter with hope, maybe Daniel and Claire had finally decided to formally ask her to move in with them, the way so many of her friends' children had done. After all, the big house sometimes felt so empty, and she wasn't getting any younger. She'd chosen her outfit carefully that evening. The navy blue dress that brought out her silver hair, the pearl earrings Robert had given her for their 40th anniversary. She'd even stopped by the fancy bakery downtown to pick up that chocolate tart Claire always raved about, the one that cost $35, but was supposedly worth every penny. As she stood in her bedroom, adjusting her earrings one final time, Margaret felt that warm, familiar glow of anticipation. This was what family was all about, these moments of togetherness, these shared celebrations, these bonds that made all her sacrifices worthwhile. At 75, having lost her husband and most of her oldest friends, these family gatherings were the highlights of her month. She glanced at the framed photo on her nightstand, Robert on their wedding day, young and handsome in his Navy uniform, his arm around her waist as they cut their simple but beautiful cake. "I wish you were here to see this, honey," she whispered, the way she did every evening. "Our boy is doing so well. We raise him right." If only she could have known what was waiting for her, just 20 minutes away. If only she could have seen the text message that would arrive in exactly 7 minutes, shattering not just her evening plans, but her entire understanding of who she was to the family she loved more than life itself. Margaret was reaching for her car keys, the chocolate tart carefully boxed and sitting by the front door, when her phone buzzed. She nearly ignored it. After all, she was already running 5 minutes behind, and she hated being late. But something made her glance at the screen, and what she saw there would replay in her mind for months to come. The message was from Daniel's number. "Mom, don't come. Claire doesn't want you here. You embarrass us in front of guests." I want you to imagine that moment. Friends, picture Margaret, dressed in her finest, holding her car keys, excited about an evening with her beloved family, reading those 21 words that would tear her world apart. She read it once, then twice, then 3 times, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. "You embarrass us." The words hit her like physical blows. Margaret, who had taught hundreds of students with patience and grace. Margaret, who had volunteered at the church soup kitchen every Thursday for 15 years. Margaret, who had raised money for the local library and organized neighborhood watch meetings. This Margaret apparently embarrassed her own family. She sank into Robert's old recliner, the one she kept exactly as he left it, still holding the phone with trembling hands. The rational part of her mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe there had been some misunderstanding. Maybe Daniel's phone had been hacked. Maybe this was some cruel joke, though Daniel had never been one for pranks. But deep down, in that place where we keep the truths we don't want to acknowledge, Margaret knew this message was real. She thought about the last few family gatherings, replaying them through this new, harsh lens. Claire's subtle eye rolls when Margaret would share stories about her teaching days. The way Daniel would quickly change the subject whenever Margaret mentioned feeling lonely or suggested spending more time together. The polite but distant way her grandchildren hugged her goodbye, as if they were fulfilling an obligation rather than expressing affection. When had she become a burden? When had the woman who had sacrificed everything for this family become someone they were ashamed of? Margaret tried to remember the last time Daniel had called her just to talk, not because he needed something. She couldn't recall a single instance in the past 2 years. The chocolate tart sat by the door, a $35 symbol of her excitement and anticipation, now mocking her in its pristine white box. She thought about driving over anyway, demanding an explanation, forcing a confrontation. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the dignity that 40 years of teaching had instilled in her, or maybe it was the echo of her mother's voice saying, "Never go where you're not wanted, Margaret. It only makes things worse." Instead, she did something that surprised even herself. She walked to her home office, the small room where she'd graded thousands of papers over the years, and pulled out a thick manila folder from her file cabinet. Inside were copies of every check she'd written to Daniel and his family over the past 15 years. Every bank transfer, every receipt, every financial gift that had come from her heart and her dwindling savings account. As she spread the documents across her desk, the numbers told a story that took her breath away. The house down payment, $150,000. Claire's Lexus SUV, $60,000. Nathan's Harvard tuition for his freshman year alone, $40,000. The roof repair after Hurricane Sandy, $25,000. The family vacation to Europe last summer that she'd insisted on paying for, $15,000. The emergency loan when Daniel's contracting business hit a rough patch, $35,000. The list went on and on. Christmas gifts, birthday parties, emergency expenses, small favors that had added up to enormous sums. By her calculations, Margaret had given her son's family over $400,000 in the past decade alone. That was nearly her entire inheritance from Robert, nearly everything they had worked and saved for together during their 42 years of marriage. And what had she received in return? Polite thank you notes, obligatory holiday visits. And now, apparently, she had become such an embarrassment that her own son couldn't bear to have her around his friends. Margaret sat in that quiet room, surrounded by the evidence of her generosity and their ingratitude, and felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't quite anger yet. That would come later. It was something deeper and more profound. It was a slow, dawning recognition that she had been playing a role in a script written entirely by other people, and that role was apparently that of the generous but inconvenient elderly mother who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention came her way. The phone rang. Daniel's ringtone. She'd set it to "Here Comes the Sun," because it always made her smile. Tonight, it sounded almost mocking. She let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message with a mixture of dread and curiosity. "Hey, Mom, sorry about the text. Change of plans tonight, but maybe we can get together next week? I'll call you." His voice was casual, dismissive, as if he'd just canceled a dentist appointment rather than crushed his mother's heart and evening. That's when Margaret realized something that would change everything. She had been so busy being the perfect, accommodating, generous mother that she had forgotten to require anything in return. Not money. She had never wanted money, but respect. Basic human decency. The kind of love that doesn't come with conditions and spreadsheets. She looked around her office, at the walls lined with thank you letters from former students, at the photo of her and Robert at their retirement party, at the small frame quote that had guided her teaching philosophy for 4 decades. Respect is earned through actions, not demanded through authority. For the first time in years, Margaret wondered if she had been giving respect without requiring it in return. And for the first time in her 75 years, she began to consider what it might feel like to stop. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She found herself wandering through her house like a ghost, seeing everything with new eyes. The living room where Daniel and Claire would sit during their monthly visits, always checking their phones, always ready to leave after exactly an hour. The dining room table where she'd hosted countless family dinners, watching her family eat the meals she'd spent days preparing while they discussed their busy lives and important plans that somehow never seemed to include her except as a source of funding. She made herself a cup of chamomile tea, the same brand her mother had always sworn by, and settled into the kitchen nook where she and Robert used to sit every morning, sharing coffee and the newspaper in comfortable silence. The moonlight streaming through the window illuminated the refrigerator door, covered with photos and magnets and little reminders of the life she'd built. But tonight, those photos told a different story. There was the picture from Nathan's high school graduation. She remembered that day so clearly, how proud she'd been, how she'd insisted on taking everyone out to the fancy steakhouse afterward. The bill had been $300, but seeing Nathan smile as he talked about his college plans had made every penny worth it. Or so she thought. Now, she noticed something she'd never seen before. In the photo, Nathan was looking at his phone while she was trying to take the picture. Even on his graduation day, she hadn't been worth his full attention. The memories came flooding back, each one now tinged with new understanding. Like the time she surprised him with tickets to the Red Sox playoffs, $800 for the family, another $200 for parking and concessions. Daniel had seemed grateful, but she remembered now I'd spent most of the game texting about work, how Claire had complained about the heat, how the kids had asked to leave early, or the Christmas when she bought Nathan that expensive laptop he'd been wanting, $2,500 for the top-of-the-line MacBook Pro that would help him with his college applications. She'd wrapped it herself, so excited to see his face when he opened it. But when Christmas morning came, Nathan had barely looked up from his old phone when he unwrapped it, muttered a quick, "Thanks, Grandma," and immediately started texting his friends about his other gifts. Each memory was like turning over a rock and finding something ugly underneath. The birthday party she'd paid for where she felt like a guest at her own expense. The family photos where she was always slightly outside the group, as if she was there by invitation rather than by right. The conversations that stopped when she entered the room, as if her presence was an interruption rather than a joy. But it was the pattern of the phone calls that hurt most of all. Margaret pulled out her phone and scrolled through her call history with Daniel. The pattern was unmistakable. Every call from him was preceded by some expense or crisis. The call about Nathan needing help with his car insurance payment, just 2 days before a $500 transfer from her account. The call about how stressed Claire was about work, just 3 days before Margaret offered to pay for a spa weekend for her daughter-in-law. She thought she was being loving. She thought she was being helpful. She thought she was being the kind of mother and grandmother she'd always wanted to be. But sitting in her kitchen at 2 a.m., surrounded by the evidence of her own generosity and their casual indifference, Margaret began to understand that she hadn't been loving her family. She'd been purchasing their tolerance. The financial manipulation had been so subtle, so gentle, that she'd never recognized it for what it was. Daniel never demanded money outright. Instead, he'd share his worries, his stresses, his fears about providing for his family. And Margaret, with her teacher's heart and her widow's loneliness, had responded the only way she knew how, by trying to solve every problem with her checkbook. Maybe if I help them just a little more, she'd tell herself after each transaction, they'll have more time to spend with me. Maybe if I take away their financial stress, they'll be happier, more relaxed, more able to enjoy my company. But the opposite had happened, hadn't it? The more she gave, the more they seemed to pull away. The more she solved their problems, the more problems they seemed to develop. It was like feeding a stray cat. Each act of kindness only brought more demands, more expectations, more dependency without any real gratitude or genuine affection. Margaret thought about her friend Helen Brooks, whose daughter lived across the country, but called every Sunday just to chat. Helen never helped with her daughter's mortgage, never sent money for the grandchildren's expenses. Yet Helen's family visited for weeks every summer, genuinely excited to spend time together. They laughed until late into the evening, sharing stories and making memories that had nothing to do with financial transactions. When was the last time Margaret's family had visited just because they wanted to see her? When was the last time Daniel had called to ask about her health, her day, her feelings? When was the last time one of her grandchildren had sought her advice or shared their dreams with her? The truth was becoming crystal clear in the harsh light of that text message. She hadn't been a beloved mother and grandmother. She'd been an ATM with a heartbeat, a reliable source of funds that came with the inconvenience of human emotions and the expectation of basic courtesy. Margaret finished her tea and made a decision that would surprise everyone who thought they knew her. She wasn't going to confront Daniel tonight. She wasn't going to call back or send angry texts or demand explanations. Instead, she was going to really think, about what kind of relationship she wanted with her family and what she was willing to accept going forward. Because sometimes, my dear friends, the most powerful thing an elderly person can do is not to react in a heat of emotion, but to let their elderly wisdom guide them toward a response that honors their own dignity. And Margaret Holloway was about to discover just how powerful that wisdom could be. The next morning brought one of those crisp October days that New England is famous for, with maple leaves painting the world in shades of gold and crimson. Margaret woke up feeling different. Not sad, not angry, but strangely clear-headed. She made her coffee extra strong and sat down with those financial documents again, this time with the methodical mind of the educator she'd always been. What she discovered was a masterclass in financial manipulation disguised as family love. Every major expense in Daniel's life had somehow become her responsibility, but presented in such a way that she felt privileged to help. The cunning was almost admirable if it hadn't been so devastating. Take Claire's career, for example. That $60,000 SUV wasn't just a gift. It was positioned as an investment in Claire's professional image. Margaret remembered the conversation now with painful clarity. Claire had sat at this very kitchen table, tears in her eyes, explaining how she was losing clients to other real estate agents who looked more successful. She talked about how hard it was to compete, how much she wanted to contribute financially to the family, how embarrassed she felt about their old Honda. Margaret had practically begged Claire to let her help. "Consider it a business loan," she'd said. "Pay me back when your commissions increase." Of course, the payback had never materialized, and after 6 months, it had somehow transformed from a loan into a gift that Claire would never forget. Yet here they were, and Claire apparently found Margaret so forgettable that she couldn't bear to have her around dinner guests. Then there was Nathan's education. Margaret had been so proud when he'd gotten into Harvard, so eager to help make his dreams possible. But as she looked through his academic records, yes, she kept copies of everything. She noticed something troubling. Nathan's grades had been declining each semester, even as her financial support increased. His freshman year, paid entirely by her $40,000 check, had ended with a 2.8 GPA and 3 incomplete courses. When she gently asked about his studies during their last phone call, Nathan had been dismissive. College is different now, Grandma. It's not about grades anymore. It's about networking and experiences. Experiences, apparently, that cost additional money for fraternity fees, spring break trips, and a lifestyle that seemed more focused on social media posts than academic achievement. But the most painful revelation came when Margaret looked through her phone records and cross-referenced them with her bank statements. The pattern was undeniable. Every significant financial request had been preceded by a period of increased contact. Daniel would suddenly start calling more often, asking about her health, sharing news about the kids, even inviting her to casual dinners. She felt so happy during these periods, so included and valued. But the moment her check cleared, the calls would taper off. The invitations would become less frequent. The warmth in their voices would cool back to polite but distant pleasantries. She'd been trained, like one of Pavlov's dogs, to associate their affection with her ability to solve their financial problems. The phone rang. Daniel again. This time, Margaret surprised herself by answering. "Hi, honey," she said, her voice steady. "Mom, thank God. I've been worried sick. You didn't answer last night, and I was afraid something had happened to you. I'm fine, Daniel. Just thinking." "About what?" "Listen, about Saturday night. I'm really sorry. Claire was just stressed about having her boss over, and you know how she gets when she's nervous. She didn't mean anything by it." There was again the gentle manipulation disguised as explanation. Claire's feelings were more important than Margaret's. Claire's stress justified Margaret's humiliation. And somehow, Margaret was expected to understand and forgive and pretend it never happened. "Where are you having dinner?" Margaret asked quietly. "What do you mean?" "The family dinner. Where are you having it?" There was a long pause. "At home. At our house. The house I put the down payment on." Another pause, longer this time. "Mom, what's gotten into you? You've always been happy to help us." "Happy to help," Margaret repeated slowly. "Tell me, Daniel, when was the last time you called me just to say hello? Not because you needed something. Not because there was a crisis or an expense or a problem to solve. Just because you wanted to hear your mother's voice." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Margaret wondered if he'd hung up. Finally, Daniel spoke, and his voice had an edge to it that she'd never heard before. "Mom, I don't have time for this. We're going through a really stressful period right now, and I need my family to support me, not create more drama." "Support you," Margaret said, and she could hear her own voice growing stronger. "The way I supported you with $150,000 for your house? The way I supported you with $60,000 for Claire's car? The way I've supported you with over $400,000 in the past 10 years. You kept track." Daniel's voice was shocked, almost accusatory. "I was a teacher for 40 years, honey. I always keep track." What followed was a conversation that would haunt both of them. Daniel tried to backtrack, to explain, to justify. He talked about how grateful they all were, how much they appreciated everything she'd done. But when Margaret asked him directly, "If I never gave you another penny, would you still want me in your life?" His hesitation told her everything she needed to know. After she hung up, Margaret sat in the silence of her house and felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. Not sadness. She had plenty of that since Robert died. Not anger. That was too hot, too immediate. What she felt was a cold, clear recognition of her own power. For the first time in years, maybe decades, Margaret understood that she had choices. And those choices didn't have to be guided by fear of losing her family's love, because that love, she was beginning to realize, might never have been real in the first place. Margaret didn't sleep much that night, but when Monday morning came, she was up and dressed by 6 a.m. with the purposefulness of a woman who had finally found her mission. She made herself breakfast, real breakfast, with scrambled eggs and toast and fresh orange juice, not the hasty coffee and granola bars she usually grabbed while rushing to accommodate everyone else's schedules. At exactly 9 a.m., when the bank opened, Margaret was their first customer of the day. She'd been banking at the same Boston Community Bank for 38 years, and Patricia, the branch manager, knew her by name. "Good morning, Mrs. Holloway. How can we help you today?" "Patricia," Margaret said, settling into the chair across from Patricia's desk with the same calm authority she'd once used to quiet a rowdy classroom. "I need to make some significant changes to my accounts." What followed was a conversation that would send shockwaves through the Holloway family tree. Margaret revoked Daniel's power of attorney, something she granted him 3 years earlier when she'd had a minor surgery and needed someone to handle her affairs temporarily. She canceled the automatic monthly transfers that had been quietly sending $2,000 every month to help with Nathan's college expenses. She removed Daniel and Claire as beneficiaries on her savings accounts. "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Holloway?" Patricia asked gently. "These are some pretty major changes." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Margaret replied. "I've spent the past 15 years funding other people's dreams. It's time I started funding my own." The next stop was her attorney's office. Richard Walsh had handled her and Robert's legal affairs for 20 years, and he greeted her with the warm familiarity of an old friend. "Margaret, how lovely to see you. What brings you in today?" "I need to change my will, Richard. Completely." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. He'd seen plenty of family drama play out in his office over the years, and he recognized the tone of a woman who had reached her limit. "I'm listening," he said simply. Margaret's knew what was a work of art. The bulk of her estate would go to charity. The literacy foundation she'd supported for years, the scholarship fund for underprivileged students that she and Robert had established, and the local food bank where she'd volunteered every Thursday. Daniel would receive exactly what he'd given her in return for her generosity, a token amount that acknowledged their relationship without rewarding his behavior. But the real masterpiece was a trust fund she established for Emma, her 16-year-old granddaughter. Emma would receive access to funds for college tuition and living expenses, but only if she maintained a relationship with Margaret that wasn't contingent on financial support. The trust included a letter that Margaret dictated that morning, explaining her decision and her hope that Emma would learn from this family drama story what real love looks like. "One more thing, Richard," Margaret said as she signed the documents. "I want Daniel to know about these changes, but not immediately. Give it 2 weeks. Let him experience what it feels like to assume he can count on something that's no longer there." By noon, Margaret had accomplished more than she had in months. But she wasn't done. Her next call was to Helen Brooks, her dearest friend and the one person who had always told her the truth, even when it hurt. "Helen, it's Margaret. Are you free for lunch?" "Of course, dear. Everything all right? You sound different." "Everything is about to be all right. Can you meet me at that little cafe on Newberry Street? I have something to tell you." Over chicken salad sandwiches and Helen's raised eyebrows, Margaret laid out the entire story. The text message, the financial history, her morning of legal and banking changes. Helen listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. When Margaret finished, Helen was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. "Do you know what Rob would say if he were here?" Helen asked. Margaret shook her head. "He'd say it's about damn time." They both started laughing then, the kind of deep, cleansing laughter that comes after years of holding back tears. Other diners turned to look at these two elderly women cackling like schoolgirls, but neither of them cared. "You know what the funny thing is?" Margaret said, wiping her eyes. "I feel guilty. Here I am, finally standing up for myself, and part of me still feels like I'm being mean to them." "That's exactly the problem, sweetheart," Helen replied. "You've been so well trained to put their needs first that advocating for yourself feels selfish. But there's nothing selfish about requiring basic respect from the people you love." Helen was right, of course. Margaret had spent so many years being the family's problem solver, their safety net, their reliable source of both financial and emotional support, that she'd forgotten she was allowed to have needs of her own. She confused being accommodating with being loving, and she confused their dependency with their affection. That afternoon, Margaret did something she hadn't done in years. She went shopping for herself. Not for gifts of the family, not for supplies for hosting dinners, not for things that would make other people happy. She bought herself a beautiful cashmere scarf in deep purple, her favorite color, though she'd somehow stopped wearing it because Claire had once mentioned that it made her look too attention-seeking. She bought herself a hardcover book that looked interesting, even though it cost $35, and she usually waited for the library copy. She bought herself good cheese and fresh flowers, and a bottle of wine that she would drink by herself if she wanted to, without apologizing to anyone for the expense or the indulgence. As she carried her purchases home, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: the simple pleasure of pleasing herself. And as she unlocked her front door and stepped into her house that she owned free and clear, that no one could exclude her from, she realized that reclaiming her financial independence was just the beginning. The real work of setting boundaries and demanding respect was about to begin. 3 days passed in unusual peace. Margaret didn't call Daniel, didn't text the grandchildren, didn't check in on anyone's problems or offer solutions to crises she hadn't been asked to solve. Instead, she did something revolutionary. She lived her own life. She spent Tuesday morning reorganizing her craft room, a space that had been neglected, while she focused on everyone else's needs. She started a watercolor painting for the first time in 20 years. She called her college roommate in California and spent an hour catching up, laughing about old professors and shared memories that had nothing to do with being anyone's mother or grandmother. But on Thursday afternoon, the consequences of her bank visits came crashing down on Daniel's world. The automatic payment for Nathan's October tuition had bounced. The monthly transfer that helped cover their mortgage payment had simply vanished. And Daniel's attempt to access the joint savings account he'd grown accustomed to using for emergencies had been blocked. The pounding on Margaret's front door came at exactly 4:47 p.m. She knew it was Daniel before she looked through the peephole. That aggressive, urgent knocking was exactly how he demanded attention as a toddler when he wanted something immediately. Margaret took her time walking to the door. She smoothed her hair, checked her reflection in the hallway mirror, and took a deep breath before opening it. Daniel stood on her porch looking disheveled and desperate, his usually perfect contractor's appearance marred by obvious stress. His hair was uncombed, his shirt wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Mom, what the hell have you done?" The words tumbled out before he'd even stepped inside. "The bank called Claire. They said you've frozen everything. Nathan's tuition payment bounced, and he might get kicked out of Harvard. We can't cover the mortgage this month without that transfer. What's gotten into you?" Margaret stepped aside to let him in, noting how he stormed past her without so much as a hello or an acknowledgement of her well-being. She led him to the living room and gestured to Robert's old chair while she settled onto the sofa. "I made some changes," she said simply. "Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." "Coffee? Coffee." Daniel's voice cracked with disbelief. "Mom, we're about to lose our house, and you're offering me coffee?" Margaret tilted her head thoughtfully. "That's interesting, Daniel. When you told me not to come to dinner because I embarrassed you, did you offer me anything? An apology? An explanation? Or did you just assume I quietly accept being discarded?" For the first time since arriving, Daniel seemed to really look at his mother. She wasn't crying. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't immediately rushing to fix whatever crisis he'd brought to her door. Instead, she was sitting calmly in her own living room, wearing that purple scarf he'd always thought was too bright for her age, looking more composed than he'd seen her in years. "That text message," Daniel began, then stopped. "Mom, you have to understand. Claire was just nervous about her boss coming over. She gets anxious about these work things, and that anxiety justified humiliating me." Margaret interrupted, her voice still calm, but carrying a steel edge that reminded Daniel of his high school principal. "Tell me, son, when you decided I was too embarrassing to be seen with your important guests, did you consider that I might have feelings about that?" "Of course you have feelings. I thought you'd understand. You've always been so understanding about everything." "Understanding," Margaret repeated. "Yes, I suppose I have been. I understood when you needed $150,000 for a house down payment. I understood when Claire needed a luxury car. I understood when Nathan needed Ivy League tuition. I've understood my way through nearly $500,000 of your problems. Daniel's face went white. You been keeping track? I was a teacher for 40 years, Daniel. Organization and documentation were my profession. Did you really think I wouldn't notice that every time you call me, it cost me money? Did you honestly believe I couldn't see the pattern? What happened next was a conversation that had been building for 15 years. Daniel tried every technique that had worked before: guilt, manipulation, appeals to family loyalty, reminders of how grateful they all were. He talked about Nathan's future, about Claire's career, about the grandchildren who needed their grandmother's support. But something had fundamentally shifted in Margaret. She listened to his pleas with the same detached attention she'd once given to students who hadn't done their homework and were trying to convince her that their excuses justified special treatment. "Daniel," she said finally, "answer me one question honestly. If I had never given you a penny, would you still want me in your life?" "That's not fair. You're my mother." That's not an answer. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Finally, Daniel slumped forward in his chair, his head in his hands. "I don't know," he whispered. "I honestly don't know anymore." It was the first honest thing he'd said to her in years, and ironically, it was also the most devastating. But Margaret felt something unexpected as she heard those words: relief. The pretense was finally over. The exhausting dance of financial manipulation disguised as family love had finally been acknowledged for what it was. "Thank you for being honest," Margaret said gently. "Now, let me be honest with you. I've spent 15 years trying to buy your love and respect. I've confused enabling your dependency with being a good mother. But I finally learned something important. Real love doesn't require payment plans." Daniel looked up at her, and for a moment, she saw not the desperate man who'd been pounding on her door, but the little boy who used to help her grade papers at the kitchen table, who used to beg her to read him just one more bedtime story. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Now," Margaret said, standing up and walking to the window to look out at her garden.